Welcome to Spashett Speed Secrets. Tonight we're asking David questions. Brilliant. So, well, we tried getting Rob Jackson to ask the question, but it looks like we can't get him. He's all gone all shy. I'll just quickly check to see if no, he's disappeared. So I will ask his question for you, David. David, how do you fill a friction damper effectively to provide a consistent damping on both sides of the car? So this is the side dampers for everyone. How do you fill that effectively?
Okay, so for me personally, the only way to replicate filling it the same every single time is to make sure it's full. Some people like to put a little smear on there. Some people like to put a tiny bit to adjust it with the same weight oil. But for me personally, I like to fill it. So see if we can see and do this on camera. So first thing that's really important is you've got to make sure the old tube nice and clean. I use a pipe cleaner or spray, clean it out, make sure it's absolutely perfectly clean. And then I'm not sure you can be able to see this on the camera, but a bit of oil. Now I always put some in the tube first. Trust me to choose something that's too thick. There we go. So now we've got some inside the tube. And then we're going to put some on the old straw. Now the straw will have grooves in there depending on which ones you've got. So I'll see if I can show you this on the camera. Okay, so when you put the tube in and just twist it. And what you'll see when you twist it is you get an equal spread all the way around the tube. If you can see that. Now as you twist it, slowly and you push it in, it will fill every single groove up. So now I've just gone past a groove. If I pull it back, that groove is full. And then I keep twisting it and pushing it in and pushing it in. Another groove, another one full. Another one full. Another one full. And then to the end. And then on one end, there'll be a bleed hole. There'll be a bleed hole right at the end. And just keep pushing. And you'll see that it comes out at the end. So it's absolutely full. Clean off the excess and then it's good to use. And that's how I fill up the side tubes.
Well, that seemed very easy, didn't it? I mean, personally, I've done it similar to that, but I push it in much harder and it fires out the end, and then I have to go again.
Yeah. So, if you just have two to start with, but then slowly twist the tube as you put it in, making sure you fill the slots every single step of the way. It must be full.
Yeah.
And then when you push it at the end and you get it come out of the air hole at the end, and you clean that off. When you then pull the tube out to then pop it onto your ball cups, the tube must be full of grease, and it's in the area that your tube will be using.
Well, I mean that's fantastic. I mean that saved me about £3 a race meeting in oil, as.
But then you'll know the difference because it's full. If you go from 20k to 10k to 7, whatever, you will actually feel the difference because full is full. So you can replicate it time after time after time. Because
when we spoke to Ollie Jeffries on the podcast, one of the things that he did after every single run is he redoes his side dampers. Is that something that you do?
So what I try and do when I put the side tube on my car, I try and have it so that little air hole is pointing upwards. Because obviously the grease is going to want to run down the tube and out the hole. So what I try and do is have this tiny little breathe hole at the top. So the oil will sit in the bottom, full. But if I see this start leaking, and I see excess tyre fluff and stuff stuck on the end, then yes, I'll redo the tube. But doing it the way I've done it, the amount of friction that you have between here and here that's clean stays more consistent for longer. Because all of those slots, if I pull that out now, every single one of those slots is full of grease. So that will stay more consistent for a lot longer.
So, I mean, as speed secrets go, I think this is up there, isn't it? I mean, air hole upright to stop oil coming out. I mean, that's new to me.
But I mean, for me, if I do my tubes once a day, maybe I'm not as studious as maybe Ollie is or Alex is, but once a day, maybe twice a day, maybe once a weekend if I'm feeling quite lazy. Yeah, that's for me. It just lasts longer that way.
Well, very good, very good. I mean, I've asked Rob Jackson to ask the next question, but he's not unmuting himself, so I'll ask it for you. So he asked about front tyre radius.
Okay. Yep.
What does more or less radius create?
So if you round the front edges, generally the car will be smoother and easier to drive. The sharper the edges, the more direct and initial steering that you'll get. It becomes a little more edgy the less rounding you have. And that's the same for the rear as well, I found. If you run a very square-edged rear, you have grip, 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 then it just snaps away because of the sharp edge on the end. So yeah, generally rounding the rear, I'm kind of consistent all the time, but then rounding the front, if it's very high, I'd round it a little bit more to make the car smoother to drive.
So something that we spoke about a little while ago on a couple of the shows before was, in low grip, there could be an argument to have a sharper edge to get a bit more bite. But of course, if you have too much bite too soon, then you're just going to push through the grip, right? So you could almost say that on low grip, you could round it off. Equally, on high grip, you could round it off.
Yeah, you could do. You could do. Again, it's a feeling thing of when you drive. So you said high grip. So let's take the black CRC carpet. You take it to the next level. Where those guys, you're absolutely right. They leave their tyre. They don't round anything. The front tyre is completely straight, but then they super glue the whole edge of the front tyre. So they're leaving it flat to gain grip, but then they're taking away the edge of the tyre with super glue. So it doesn't grab as they enter a corner. So again, tyre profile and how you glue the tyre can really make a difference into our scale.
Because there is that with all of this stuff, there's a window, isn't it? There's a window where you kind of, well, if it's X, you do Y, but you could push Y so far that actually you've gone beyond what X can deliver, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing you need to consider as well is some wheels are bigger than others. So if you take a hot race or a contact wheel, then they're 38 millimeters in diameter, they're bigger. So because they're bigger, the effect of rounding the edge is slightly less. Whereas if you have a JFT wheel, which is smaller, rounding the edge makes a bigger difference.
Good. Well, I think that's hopefully Rob, even though he wasn't here for the initial question, he got something out of that second question. And if you've got, if you've asked the question and you want more on it, then ask more. That's kind of what we're here for. Chad Blanton, he asked, how do you clean the sort? It must be an American chap because he called it source and not additive.
Okay.
How do you clean and source tyres between runs? So tell us about how you might clean your tyres between runs, which would kind of intimate that he uses his tyres twice at a race meeting.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Include that in that sort of question as well.
Yeah. So if at a UK national in the early rounds, the track is not sticky. So therefore, realistically, I wouldn't clean my tyre because the tyre has no pickup on the tyre when I finish the race. I've lost grip as I've gone through the 8 minutes, and by the end of it, I've lost grip, so the tyre is therefore clean. If, however, the track is sticky and gummy, and you finish the race and your tyres are loaded, so you can actually see and feel the tack on the top, for me, all I do is I get Worth brake cleaner on a tissue, wipe it round just once to remove as much of that black stuff as I possibly can, and then I let it air dry. I don't want to attack the foam with anything at all. I just want to use additive on the foam, but I just want to clean that tack away. And that's the only thing I would do.
And what about reusing tyres during a race meet?
Okay, so generally when you run a new set of tyres, they're freer and looser to drive, so potentially faster. If you rerun a set of tyres, if you have to clean them or not, generally the car will start the race with more stability because they're already grooved in. But the drag and load and your rolling resistance will increase quicker during the run because the pickup will occur faster. So whereas a new tyre may give you less rolling resistance for 6 or 7 minutes, a used tyre could give you a higher rolling resistance within 2 or 3 and therefore be slower if the grip is that high.
Well, I mean, that kind of covers Chad's third question about, 1 or 2 runs, which are quicker. I mean, you've explained kind of what a 1-run tyre does and what a 2-run tyre is. And so hopefully that's given him some insight. Now, Tony Wade has got a question, so we will cut to Tony. Now, I know Tony's been looking all forward to this all week to come on, because he loves you more than life itself. And hopefully, are you there, Tony?
Hello, yes, I am.
Hello, Tony Wade, everybody. Tony, it's lovely to see you. It's lovely to see you. I know you've been back to work this week for the first for the first time after this pandemic. So, ask David your question. Over to you, Tony.
Right, I was just going to. I can't remember the other question I asked, but I know one of them. Is it more? Is it better to use a matched set of pinions and spurs rather than, say, like using a Kimbrough spur gear and an Aromax pinion, or is it better to use a Xenon one and a Xenon one? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I mean, they should be the same pitch. 64 pitch should be the same from every manufacturer, but the detail in the production, if you did stay within brand, should in theory be a little bit better.
So if you got a match set, it'd be more efficient.
It should be, because hopefully that manufacturer has taken time and care to make sure the match between the pinion and the spur is perfect. And the way you tell is just drive it. And if it's loud, you're wasting energy. If it's not loud, then it's a good match.
Because I've noticed all the top guys like yourself, you can never really hear your car go around. It's dead quiet. I know they're meshed properly, but I was just wondering whether it'd be
yeah.
Same.
Again, that's just making sure we maximise the effort of the motor as much as we can, and we don't want a pinion and gear grinding itself together to lose horsepower.
Yeah.
And I think the other part of your question was the Aromax pinion.
Yeah.
And the
reason, that's an example, like, you know.
Yeah. So some of the guys have started using the Aromax pinion because it's super lightweight.
Yeah.
Because using such big pinions now, by having the plastic gear, they're super light and they're still efficient and they're still really, really quiet.
The other question that you asked on the page, Tony, was about how you obtain a rollout. You can obtain, let's say, a 75 rollout.
Okay.
Having a big spur, small pinion.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Smaller spur. Maybe talk through what the benefits of changing size of spur gear to accommodate a rollout.
Okay, so smaller spur gear, smaller pinion, in theory, in practice, should give you more lift. Should, in theory. A bigger spur gear with a bigger pinion should be smoother to drive, in theory. But the other thing that does happen, which makes, I believe, a bigger difference, is you're moving the weight of the motor forwards and backwards within the pod. Yeah. So, of course, you have the lever from the pivot to the axle, and you're moving this weight forwards and backwards. And that, to me, makes a bigger difference.
Where would you suggest the best for the weight of the motor, forward or backwards? You know, which.
So with a differential, we always run generally in 13.5 a 76 spur, and we move the motor closer to the axle.
Yeah.
But with a solid axle, we have slowly been moving the motor further forwards away from the axle, and we found that to be more consistent.
All right.
Does that answer your questions, Tony?
Yeah, well, I thought that was beautiful. That's what I wanted to know, yeah.
As are you, Tony. As are you. And I look forward to seeing you in the flesh, because there's a hell of a loving going on. See you soon, pal. So, lovely to hear from Tony. A lot of love for that fella. So the next one going on, quite an interesting a few questions here by sort of someone coming back into racing after 10 years out. One of the questions he asks about is, how can I improve or increase the reaction of his car but without compromising stability? Good question.
Oh. Yeah, well, we'd all like that. Obviously, the more dynamic we can make a car and the faster we can make it and still keep it stable, I mean, that's just simply working with the damping and the springs that you're using and finding a combination that you like the feel of. So if you want it to react faster, you might be someone that likes slightly less damping with a slightly stiffer spring, so it can react quicker. It will center quicker as well. And you might be someone that prefers to have less front damping with a stiffer spring as well. So that's going to be a case of going and testing and finding out what you preferred.
I think coming back, or coming to maybe a different generation. I mean, you've been around since Noah's Ark, and and you've seen the evolution, very much like your haircut. The evolution of the sport, and how these cars have changed from 15 years ago to what they are now. Is there maybe 1, 2, 3 points that you do differently as a wholesale core belief applications now to what you did maybe 15 years ago?
Not really. I have to be honest. No, not really. It's a race car.
Yeah.
Most important thing are the 4 little foam things that touch the floor, and preparation of those has been the same 15, 20 years ago as they are today. Without them, then you have nothing. So yeah, if I have to pick number 1, it's tyre prep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's a good thing for us all to take on board, isn't it? What you're trying to do to translate all of the effort you're putting into the car onto the track. The only contact is the tyres, right, as you say. So I think that's a good thing to hone in on. Paul Hinton, I don't think we've got Paul on. Oh, Paul is on. I apologise. So I will cut over to you, Paul.
Hi, Stu.
Hey, Paul.
You all right? It was another question for Dave, just about how to set up a new motor.
Okay.
When you get it, so how do you find the optimum amount of timing and gearing combination to make your motor perform the best?
Yeah, so if I take a fresh motor, the first thing I'll do is I'll put it onto a motorizer, onto a checker, and I'll write down what she is. That's my baseline. Then when you actually go to the track, of course, the track is the ultimate racing dyno, isn't it? That's where you need it to perform. So for me, I watch it down the main straight and check it's not undergeared, it's not peaking too early, and check it's not overgeared and it's still accelerating when I back off for the end of the main straight. Get the gearing roughly in the ballpark, so just over the 3/4 mark on the main straight, she's maxed out. She's hit the limit, that's it, that's what she's got. Do a whole run and then see how she fades during the run. Now, if there is no fade and it stays strong for the whole run, I will then time the motor up. And I will keep doing that until it starts to fade. If when I time it up, the main straight speed gets too much and it doesn't reach its max again, I will drop a pinion and then keep timing up until I get the very, very slightest hint of fade towards the end of a run. Because there's nothing worse than leading a race or being in a race for 7 minutes, then have your motor fall off a cliff. So some people say to me, what temperature do you run your stuff at? And the honest answer is I don't care what temperature the motor comes off at, as long as during the run I don't get any fade towards the end. So it is trial and error. But once I have that motor now set, I'll then put that back on my motor checker and get some numbers from it as a baseline guideline for that brand of motor for next time. So by trial and error of myself and teammates, we will build up a reference library of what we like and why. So some tracks that are very, very long, very, very big, we might prefer less timing with a bigger gear. And then on other tracks, we may prefer more timing on a shorter gear so the motor can spool up quicker. So they're the 2 things we really look at.
How's Paul?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. When you're talking about fade, one of the things I've struggled with is how can you tell if it's the motor that's fading or if it's just your cells or maybe past their best?
So generally when it's the motor that fading, it's difficult to explain. This is a feeling thing you get. So for me, when I start entering the infield, if I start driving harder and harder and harder and the motor is fading, if I then back off the throttle for a moment and just give the whole system just a break, just for a moment, the battery voltage should recover. If it recovers and then you go again and it's a bit more sprightly, that's your LiPo that's fading, not necessarily the motor that's fading. But that's a very, very difficult thing to quantify. So therefore, at the end of the run, if you're unsure, you grab the motor and you temp it. And if it's absolutely rocket hot, then obviously it was the motor that went, not the LiPo. So again, that's something you'll learn by just testing and trying. But of course, as I've said before in previous podcasts, the answers are there when you finish a race. Don't ignore them, but use them to improve your system for next time.
Great, thank you.
All right, Paul?
Good stuff. Okay, well James Stewart made a good point there. I just want to bring him in. What did you mention there, James, about runs between 1 and 4?
I was just adding really to what David was saying about being able to increase the timing. Just bear in mind that as the traction builds, the load on the motor increases. So a setup that doesn't overheat in round 1 might do by the time you get to round 4.
Correct, yeah.
So you need to be aware of that so that you're not cooking it. The other thing that's just come to mind thinking about it is an indication of cell quality. If your charger has got a measurement on there, look for the internal resistance. If you start noticing the internal resistance of your cells going up, there's a strong chance that's you'll feel that more in the fade than you will do.
Yeah, absolutely. And also if the IR is going up very slightly, but you've lost capacity,
yes,
that's also another symptom that your pack will fade more towards the end of a run. Yes.
Yeah.
Is that something, David, thanks very much, James, appreciate that.
Okay.
Is that something that you take into account? Are you always checking your cells during a race meeting?
Yeah, so in the lid of the box, after I've cycled it up and down and I'm ready to use it, I will write the number of milliamps it took and the IR reading, and write down the current that I used to charge and discharge for that test. And then as you go through the LiPo's life, just take a note. After the 4th, 5th, 6th charge, just do that test again and just write those numbers down and just check that your battery's not deteriorating and you're not noticing. So that's also something I've done during lockdown. Cycled all my LiPo when lockdown started, and then every couple of weeks I've done that individual test to see which LiPo are breaking in storage and which ones are living in storage. And I have left one which I've done nothing to whatsoever. So hopefully the one thing I'll learn out of this, no matter how long, depending on how long we're locked down for, is the best way to store LiPo.
Always thinking for the future, aren't you, David?
It's something which a lot of racers have learned, that when a LiPo gets activated and you start racing with it, a lot of drivers are realizing that once it's actually active, you're better off to just use it. Just keep using it. They like to be used and used and used. They don't like to be stored. So I'm just trying to find a way, the best way to store. And there might not be one, and there probably isn't one, but I've got my 4 LiPos sitting there that are being wasted, so I might as well use them for something.
One of the things that when we had Ollie Jeffries on, I think it was the 2nd episode of the podcast, he said he feels like he never can write enough down. There's always information to be taken. Is that something that you're doing after a race meeting? Because I can't say I've ever necessarily seen you with a notebook out. Or is it something that you're able to absorb and just roll with it?
As you said, I'm as old as Noah's Ark, so you've seen most of it before at some point in your life, and my racing necessarily now isn't what it should be, so my attention to detail now probably isn't what it should be. But if you're trying to learn and maximize your equipment, these are all the things that you should be doing to improve yourself. These are things which somebody can't help you with outside, or you've got to learn this yourself.
Yeah, it's every day's a school day, right?
Every day.
Stu Barber wanted to know about the effects of track width, front and rear, and what are those effects?
Okay, so generally in the rear, the wider you make it, the more stable the car becomes. The more stable the car becomes, the harder it is to make the car rotate on the rear. When you widen the front, generally, the car will not want to change direction as well initially, but will generally have more traction after that, the wider you go in the front. So, but again, when you say wider in the front, it depends how you do that. If you add scrub shims behind the bearing, so you widen the wheel on the axle, you can gain a lot more power than if you just widen the suspension blocks on the chassis. So again, that's a very open question on the front end. It depends how you do it.
But there's only one way of doing it on the rear.
Yeah, shims on the axle. Yeah, so that just works the same way for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's. Do you think that's something that people get involved with enough of on the rear of a 12 scale car playing with?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if we went to a race and they weren't checking rear wheel axle width, well, mine would be quite considerably more than the rule book says, because the wider you go, the better the car becomes, because it becomes more stable. You can just lay the power down easier with less worry and less concern.
Yeah, and pushing on to the really, we talked about the front. Stuart says, why have people moved to carbon front arms rather than the plastic ones that we've seen over the past few years?
Probably fashion. You could also consider they're a little bit lighter than the molded plastic. And thirdly, when you have a carbon arm like that and you want to make the wheelbase 1 millimeter shorter, longer or wider, all you have to do is make a new carbon piece. Whereas when you have a molded arm, you're fixed. So I think that carbon arm gives a lot more options available to the teams to use.
Good. Neil Taylor, I know Neil's not on, unfortunately. Stu had to pop off and cook his dinner, hence why Stu couldn't ask his question. But Neil Taylor asks, and I think this is something that I think is something that I'm moving more into with the handset. He says about, are there any settings on either your transmitter or your ESC that you prefer to use? Either drag brake or steering expo, anything like that?
Okay, so on the speed controller, because I race 13.5 stock, I don't use drag brake. The frequency of the speedo, again, you can adjust the way the motor in the package feels by lowering and increasing the drive frequency from the speed controller. But generally, you end up back on base settings of between 2 and 4 kilohertz. I use a hobby wing speedo around there all the time. On the handset, I use KO. So on the handset, I do use negative exponential quite a lot. So normally -30 on the Expo, but I don't use anything else. Everything else is completely linear. There's so many functions in there. And to be honest with you, when people have had issues with their radios, when they brought KO radios up to me, they don't understand and it's doing something funny. The quickest thing and easiest thing I do to help anybody out is just do a quick factory reset everything to 0 and hand them their radio back and they say that's 100 times better. So unless you really know what you're doing with the radio, you can try stuff, of course, but just remember what you tried and put it back if you don't like it. But Expo is the only thing I really use.
Yeah, and I think something that I've done during this lockdown is get my manual out. That's that thick.
Yeah.
That's so boring. But I've kind of read up and it's given me an appetite to want to play with some of that stuff, which I think is a whole new can of worms, right? I mean,
okay, so the other thing my radio I do, and I do this for every class of racing that I do, generally find the tightest point on the track where you might use brake, go into that corner and just thump full brake and keep adjusting the brake either on the radio or in the ESC or a way of doing it that you don't lock the rear tyres so you can maximize the traction in that braking zone in that area. Because in theory, you should never need more brake than that anywhere else on the racetrack. So that's something which in 8 scale is really important, but also in 12 scale to make sure you don't lock that rear axle. So that's brake force in the speedo, or you can adjust the brake travel in your radio.
Yeah, I mean, we take it for granted, a lot of these abbreviations. But David Borton, he's a newbie. Can you just briefly explain what Exponential is? Okay, so Exponential. If, for example, your thumb moves 5 millimeters and the servo horn moves 5 millimeters. If your thumb moves 5 millimeters and the servo horn moves 1 millimeter, but then as you slowly increase your thumb, there'll be a point on a curve where the curve, so the servo saver, will then exponentially go up. So you'll have more, it'll be a finer adjustment at the end. When you go 1 click more, it will shoot upwards. So we use it to dull the car a little bit around neutral to make it easier to drive. Sorry, I'm laughing, but a really good explanation of Exponential there. But Rob Jackson says he's doing a degree in advanced physics, so he can understand the Sanwa handset manual perfectly. Because they are complicated things, aren't they? The manuals, I mean, crikey. I mean, you'd really need a week at a track with the manual to have a fiddle around with what some of these handsets can do. They've almost gone beyond the point that us humans can actually adapt to what they're offering.
Yeah, I mean, I know some of the guys are messing with servo speeds, and they've got programmable servos. You can also, in the KO radio, you can also do that. So when you bang the steering over, it will send a signal that slows that input down so the car behaves more sedately. Yeah, you can mess with that, but at the end of the day, yes, I use the Exponential. Yes, I do, but I prefer the car to do what I ask it to do.
Yeah.
But again, it's each to their own. And I'm old school. I don't understand all of that type of stuff, so I stay away from it.
Yeah. But I think for those of you that like having a fiddle around, I think you've probably got so much on your transmitter that you haven't optimized. That might be an area to have a play around with as well. Part of the hobby, right? I mean, we've all got different things we like to get out of it. I love a gadget, and I love, trying out these new things as well. A good question here. So Matt Jones wants to talk about Motorlizer.
Okay.
So he says he's watched a video suggesting to adjust timing to that motor so it consumes 6 amps to get the sweet spot. How do others use these analyzers to get their motors set up efficiently?
Okay, as I said earlier, these Motorlizers are gauges. They're not the ultimate dyno because they're off-load. So they are not representative of that motor being in the car. So at the end of the day, whatever happens in the car is more important than what any tester will tell you on the bench. But what we do use them for is a baseline and a guideline. So when we have a good motor, we can write those numbers down of that brand, and then we understand more going forward when we set up other people's stuff. But generally with a brushless motor, there will become a timing point that when you turn it, the increase is negligible, but the current will jump through the roof. And we try and run just before that and no more than that. That's what I try and do anyway. And when I've been to the track and run, and I've helped guys run, and the stuff's been fast, and we've tested it, it's always seemed to be around about that spot.
I mean, you mentioned the track's the ultimate dyno. I've owned a dyno, and I remember vividly. I said to you, I called you up. I said, Dave, there's a new dyno out, and it's from America, and it's a gazillion pounds. And you laughed at me, and you said you'll have a great time with it for about a week, and then you'll pull it away and never use it again, and your track will be your dyno. And I laughed. I said, no. And you were absolutely right. Because you can sit it on a workbench all you like. And there's even a new one that I was speaking to a guy called Jason Cheng, who you might know over in America, who's got a dyno on his workbench that can simulate a race and a run. And there's just no way you can simulate this stuff. And I think you've given a really nice explanation of how you take a motor, how you go out and find where it performs or how it performs, and you build up a bit of a portfolio of using that information to tune that particular brand, because I think that's quite an important part, right? I mean, a Trinity to an R1 to...
Completely different.
Aren't they?
I say completely different. To get the maximum out of them, they do need to be tweaked and set up a little bit different, yes. So we have a little book, generally sits in my bag, that the team guys know it's there, and if they are unsure, they can always go and look. And there'll be race results and motor results from previous events in there, and they can gladly go and look and sort out what they need.
Yeah, I mean, and Andy Ward says, is it better set the timing in the car or use a dyno with a dummy load or rotating mass? As we just said, get the dyno. In fact, I think I have the dyno right here in front of me. You know, I mean, how can you expect that to create the same as what your thumbs and your steering are doing with any level of accuracy?
No. So I mean, everything is just a gauge, and it's learning how to use your gauges to help you go racing. So the only advice I can give with obviously brushless motors is do not over time them straight away. You're better off starting low and working up to the maximum rather than trying to just hit the maximum on go one. Because if you do get it wrong and cook it, you've lost possibly a very good motor straight away. So just take your time. And that's what we do club racing. You know, Stu comes with us to West Kent and Millais and stuff, and every now and again we'll drop in a new motor or something different, or try something different on a motor at a club race. But yeah, we just try and be careful and look after them, really.
Well, that's kind of rounded up all of the questions. James Stewart says, nerd mode. Technically, the Mini Pro is an accelerometer because it's a fixed load. Correct, James. That is a nerd question, which is why we're going to let that one go. So there's a chap here that, unfortunately, because I'm just a dumb golfer, I don't know how to pronounce his name. But I'll ask his question anyway. How many times do you apply it additive? Let's say you applied additive for 30 to 40 minutes on ready tyres. Some additives dry in 15 minutes on tyres.
Okay, so he's probably using rubber tyres, or he's using a very solvent-based additive.
It's actually on foam tires, but some it's basically air drying. Let's say, or it's not looking wet after some time. Let's say.
Okay, but it is wet.
Initially, yes. Let's say I'm talking about Mighty Gripper.
Okay.
So let's say if I apply additive with Spider Grip, it looks quite wet for 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
But let's say I've seen on some of your setup sheets, somebody's like keeping additive on tires for 60 minutes. Is it only single additive application, or maybe you're adding additive twice? Let's say after 20 minutes, you apply a second coat of additive to keep it wet.
So normally for me, it's once, just once.
Okay.
I've never had to, in 12 scale, I've never had to apply twice. But I think that's also why some of the guys, like Alex and Ollie and guys, are putting the tyres in those pump boxes, because they're sucking the air out of the pores, making the additive go in, but also there's less air around there for the additive to evaporate. It has to go into the tyre. So if they're leaving it for a long period of time, maybe that would be a better option for you rather than just leaving them on the table.
Okay, and after, let's say, keeping the tires for that long, do you try to dry them out before going on track?
Yeah, I mean, are you racing 12 scale?
Yes, 12 scale. Let's say you could just wipe it off, or maybe you use paper towel and maybe try to clean and make it as dry as possible before hitting the track line.
So especially with a solid axle, we try and make the rear tyre as dry as is humanly possible before we go to the track. You'll see the mechanics of anybody will have tissue in his hand, trying to keep them as dry as possible before the cars go on the track. So even up to the last minute, they'll still be drying. If the event allows, you may well then see the top driver's mechanics put the car on the racing line and gently scrub the rear tyre in the groove. Again, trying to pick up a little bit of grip, try and reduce any wet additive to give them a faster start. So again, everything we do towards the end is to get the additive off. We want it off. We don't want the tyre to bleed and have less grip. We want it to be as dry as is humanly possible.
Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
And before you go, how do you pronounce your name, please, sir?
Ludas.
Ludas.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Ludas. Whereabouts do you race?
I'm from Lithuania. So actually, I have no chance to visiting you and actually seeing anyone like with great experience.
Well, listen. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's hopefully we see you again and you can ask more questions for David.
Okay. Thanks.
Brilliant stuff. Brilliant stuff. That's what it's all about. Mr. Cool Ice, unfortunately, hasn't got a microphone, but he asked David, can you just talk a little bit about weight transfer and transfer in the car, or front to rear weight distribution, and how it affects the handling of the car?
Okay. So generally with a 12 scale car, the only part of the weight we can really move is the battery. We can move the motor in the pod a little bit forwards and backwards on gearing between pinion and spur. We can move it forwards and back a couple of millimeters, but generally the battery is what makes the biggest difference. The further forward you push the battery, generally, the easier and smoother the car is to drive, but you will gain more high-speed steering because you have more weight on the front tyre. The further back you put the battery, so the more weight you put to the back of the car, the easier it will be at a high speed. But as you release the throttle and shut down, it becomes a bit of a pendulum and can swing more into a corner and can give you more rotation in the corner. So they're the two things I found with battery placement. So that's a balancing act of putting the battery in a position that gives you the best overall feeling for that racetrack.
Fantastic. Rob Jackson asks, which additive is best for the two types of carpet that we use in the UK, ETS and Primafelt? Is there a difference in soak time as well?
ETS, we generally have an issue with high wear rate, low grip. So we generally use longer additive times on ETS carpet than we do on Primafelt. Because of the high wear rate on ETS carpet, we can't use Spider Green. We have to still use Spider Blue because it lasts longer on the tyres and it stays more consistent for the whole run. On Primafelt, when there is that black line and it is sticky, there are occasions when we can use Spider Green because green will switch on faster, but it will wear the tyre quicker. But if the track has become self-sustaining to the tyre, we can just start faster on green.
Good answer. And we're going to finish it up with one last question on transmitters. Neil Taylor, he says, just wondering why go for expensive transmitter versus a cheaper one if we only use Expo, for example. So Sanwa offers lots, KO offers lots. But yet there's a code transmitter that I bought for my first transmitter that was £30 or something, £50. Why is it that we go out and spend £400, £500 on a transmitter when we only use very few?
Yes, I think for KO now they only have that one radio. I don't think there is a low end option, but primarily what you're buying there is the 2.4 technology. You're buying this super fast connection. So the cheaper options might just be a generic coded 2.4 system. They all have to have the same protocol. It just might not be as clear cut as one of these professional systems. So you're paying a premium for this zero latency. You can never have zero, but making the system as fast as possible so you have a better connection. That's what the evolution in radios has been since the 27, 40 meg days. It's all been in that technology. And of course, there's touch screens here, there, and everywhere, which is all lovely gizmos that we all like to play with. And we all like to leave that plastic screen on to the very last minute of racing, then pull it off on race. We've all been there, and it's just nice to have.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned so much. I mean, just on that Expo thing, I was talking to Mark Payne about Curve, and Exponential. I mean, you're trying to get your steering to go from point A to point B, and obviously Expo is changing it at the start, making it less.
Yes.
Thumb.
So your thumb can move more, but the car will do less
initially. But at
and then at the end, it does
more. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you lose that linear thumb to wheel, don't you? Well, yes. with Curve, and I'm pretty sure it does it on the KO, but it does it on my Sanwa, that you can actually break that curve down and just have the Expo just at the very start and then get back to that linear feel at the end. And I think, that's an example of, yes, it's Expo, but there's sort of 3 or 4 levels of expo that a transmitter that it offers over and above. Mr. Cool Eye says he's had a cheat code tranny, never had a reason to upgrade. When I asked my dad 10 years ago, do you want an iPhone for your birthday? He said, no, what do I bloody want that for? Well, it's because he's never had email, he's never had web on his phone. And of course, whilst he doesn't necessarily use it all the time, to have that opportunity to have it every now and then to improve performance, it might be something that people want to consider, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think there is a market for having these better products, because they do enhance your enjoyment of the hobby at the end of the day, don't they? But do you think so or not?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to be driving the cars we have today with a 2740 meg set, because one loss of connection at these speeds and it's game over. I do go in the menu, and there are servo speeds you can play with, and there are functions you can play with, and there's ABS brakes you can play with, and you can turn it all on and off. But all of the radios today are far easier. If you're doing an 8-scale car with linkages everywhere, and you can set endpoints really quickly, really easily, and you can set a car up in less than 5 minutes. Whereas in the old days, where you have to adjust the linkage lengths because you can't adjust the throws on the radio, it just becomes more difficult. It's possible, just it's more time consuming. So yeah, the radios of today just make life 10 times easier.
David, it's been another insightful evening of these questions. We'll have a think about what we're going to do next Thursday. Any ideas at this stage?
I might get a haircut.
Well, listen, I can do that for you. What I mean is, remotely, I'll send you my clippers round, and that's how you can sort it out. Just very briefly, talk us through what the sort of horizon looks like from your part of the BRCA, or you have been. Any idea of where things might be going forwards? If you have no idea, obviously I have no idea, but is there any insight that you can give us into what might be on the agenda for 12 scale in the UK?
Yeah, I'm not going to leak any of the discussions that we've had specifically about what racing will occur and won't occur, but all I can tell people is that the BRCA committees are not doing nothing. They're obviously watching the news. They're looking at what's going on. They're putting plans in place that if all of a sudden lockdown was to end tomorrow, we'd have a plan in place to get you guys racing, and what would be safe for you guys to go racing, and where we could go racing. But to keep everybody updated every week after this announcement would just be ridiculous. So when something fundamentally changes with the situation we're in, I'm sure every section in the BRCA will be ready to offer racers something in this country.
And that's kind of all us racers need to hear, right? That BRCA is on the pulse, and
they're not sitting there doing nothing. They're not ignoring you. They're not ignoring their members. Of course they're not. They are looking after racetracks where they can. They are advising racetracks on what they can do and what they can't do in the future, and what protocols they're going to have to put in place to make it safe for you guys. But they are actively making sure that when time comes, we will be ready to go racing again.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that insight. Just to finish up with, just want to let everyone know that when we post these chats up on the podcast page, it'd be really nice if we had 30 people sharing them. I mean, David puts an hour of his time in, his expertise. Giving back to him for that would be to share the posts, get more people engaging with Zen Racing, what he has to offer, support the track. We all see him every national meeting there, helping out the racers. He's too bashful to, got too much humility to sort of push himself out there and say, I want something back. But I'm saying it for you. His expertise doesn't come along, and Zen Racing is the only company.
Right. Hit the subscribe button and hit the like button for us, and that'd be great.
Exactly. Well said.
We'll
see you all next week. David, thanks very much for your time, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Night, everyone.